Netflix's House of Cards just ended its six-season run. I'm Zach Laws of Gold Derby, and with me now is Jeff Beal. He's been the composer of House of Cards since the first season and has won two Emmys for his work on that show. Jeff, just tell us a little bit about going into this last season, having been there from the very beginning. What was it like for you scoring that final episode?
It was kind of intense because you always know something's going to end. You think about it for a long time. Over 6 seasons, you build up a lot of musical ideas and things that you think might work. The interesting thing about this season was that some of that happened, obviously. When I got to the final scene, it was really sort of a climax of a storyline involving Doug Stamper, obviously, and Claire Underwood. So there were some things that I borrowed from some earlier seasons that sort of made their way into the arrangement, but it sort of became this amalgamation of a lot of things, sort of trying to build to a climax. Trying to really take that emotional angst and sort of intensity to the extreme, obviously.
Right. As you mentioned, I mean, the show has undergone some changes over time, and I don't want to get into all the backstage drama of all that stuff, but
But it is significant because even putting that aside for a second, one of the real challenges we had in this season was telling our story without our former lead actor being on screen at all, which is a dramatic filmmaking cinematic challenge, and one of the things I think we were all very much trying to do they were certainly doing the writing and also the music to try to keep the ghost of Frank Underwood alive in this season. I mean, all the stuff that happens in this season in some ways is sort of um, ramifications of stuff that happened in prior seasons, obviously. So that was definitely a factor.
so then shifting the focus over to Claire, can you talk about how that affected your music?
Yeah, I mean, even before the season got rejiggered, it was always going to be more about Claire. I mean, we were sort of going that way, and I was fascinated. She's been really fascinating to me as a character because I always felt like we knew who Frank Underwood was. He sort of always was very direct. He was the one giving the direct address, letting you inside his head. Claire was always a bit more of a mystery to me, and so one of the things I love the writers did in this season was they really um, not only dealt with her present as sitting in the Oval Office and all that, but also they dealt with sort of her childhood, and we had these wonderful sort of flashbacks to her backstory, which I thought were quite fascinating because they sort of showed the formation of the psyche and the childhood relationships she had. There's a wonderful scene, I think, in one of the earlier episodes where she's sort of, basically abused by this group of rowdy boys, and it's very traumatic for her, obviously. But from that very first incident in her childhood, she fought back in a very visceral, powerful way, which, is very much like Claire's character. There's also a wonderful relationship she has with her childhood friend, which is sort of you see them in their youth, but then obviously much later in adulthood they become this brother and sister um, couple that are sort of a nemesis for Claire in the present day.
Right. So then, talk a little bit about, I guess, what I mean. She's been obviously with the show from the beginning, and her role has only increased and changed over the years. So, what kind of instrumentations, what kind of melodies do you use in order to express her character and to express the new dynamic for her character this season?
Yeah, I mean, it was in some ways it was an extension of something I'd already been doing via the operatic soprano, which sort of crept in around season two, and it was always an aspect of her strength, much like we had the trumpet and the drums, which evoke sort of Frank's sense of fire. Claire was always this sort of she had an operatic scale to her persona, so that was fun to sort of go to that well even more in this season. There was also something I used with I added one instrument in this season, which was a solo flute, which was quite useful, especially in some of those flashback episodes. But it was also interesting because I think you first hear it in the first episode of the season when she comes in the Oval Office and there's this knocking on a wall, and it turns out to be this bird that's somehow living inside the wall of the White House and is released, and so it also might represent that, like the ghost of Frank or something, sort of hovering hovering in the atmosphere a little bit. Um, there's also some interesting things with her character, which I love. This has always been part of our show, but occasionally it's kind of like real life politics. Occasionally, good things might happen, despite the sort of not so pure intentions of the people that enact them. And there's a wonderful scene in this wonderful storyline in this season where she basically fires her whole cabinet and brings in a whole female cabinet. And there's a sense in the world which a lot of people feel like, oh, gee, wouldn't that be great? Men have had we've had our turn. We've sort of messed everything up. We've had our wars and screwed everything up. So why not let that happen? And of course, it's a much needed thing that's happening in the real world as well. And then also the pregnancy is a huge part of her arc this season, and I just love that. It was so loaded with layers of meaning for her. On one level, it's this sort of beautiful maternal, thing that's happening. But of course, in Claire's world, this is also the love child of Frank. So it's also becomes a little bit more like Rosemary's Baby in a sense, like she's carrying the heir to this horribly karmically, damaged, couple. But it's really there's a great climactic scene at the end of one of our penultimate episodes where she's sort of singing this lullaby to her baby, and then she turns to the camera and says, it's just really chilling. It's terrifying. And so that was sort of, I felt like it was a very climactic moment of both the power of maternity and motherhood, but also the sort of twisting of that into her own political needs, as she's done with everything.
Right. You mentioned operatic, and I mean the show has always been kind of mounted as sort of like Greek tragedy or Shakespeare and something like that. Was that from the beginning a part of your music?
I think that sort of crept in as we went through the seasons. Certainly didn't start out that way, although it's funny. I mean, if you even listen to the main title, I mean, there's always been this sort of sense of grand epic darkness about it, which you could say that's a very much like a grand opera sort of aesthetic. It's larger than life, it's epic, it's not inconsequential. So that sensibility has always been there. And I'd say it's probably more of a sensibility than literal in the sense, yeah, the voice is there, but it's also in a lot of the way the music is composed, it's sort of mixture of classical types of harmony and counterpoint and string lines mixed with this sort of more visceral, subterranean, jazzy underbelly. It was from there from the very beginning, and it just sort of worked its way through 6 seasons, I think.
Mhm. Now, have you picked an Emmy submission episode for this season yet?
I have. It was a tough one, but in the end of the day, I chose the finale because I felt like that was really the culmination, obviously, musically and also dramatically. It was also probably one of my favorite episodes, also because of for a very simple reason of the end title, which I did something I'd never done, which is I did just a string arrangement of the main title theme, which is sort of how you leave it. And I love the way that turned out. It was sort of a last minute idea I had. As I all through the 6 seasons, I've enjoyed sort of writing these, creating a lot of specific main titles for each episode. I guess before the auto advance was a factor in Netflix watching, which I'm not a big fan of, but you can still hear the end title music if you get your Netflix set up just right. But I love that idea of having that time to sort of reflect after you've seen something, and the music sort of can answer the drama. And so I really love the way that turned out. Obviously, that last scene with Claire and Doug is really powerful and beautifully delivered. But also the whole episode just sort of has all these wonderful beats of sort of inevitable. There's an inevitable showdown that we've been sort of preparing through the whole season, which is really sort of coming to a head.
Uh, this show broke a lot of new ground. Obviously it was a continuation of sorts of this golden age of television and serialized dramas, but also in terms of binge watching and opening up the platform for a place like Netflix and other streamers to be able to have content and to attract big name stars and big name directors to do these shows. Having been on there from the beginning, now that it's over, can you just reflect a bit on what you hope the show's legacy will be?
Yeah, I hope the drama of Kevin Spacey obviously will fade away, which I think it will in terms of people's perception of the show. I think you have to separate the artist from the person that makes it. Um, but I think it will always be remembered as obviously the first major series on the platform, which I'm very proud of. Um, I think it's indicative of something that we've sort of, I wouldn't say we've taken for granted, but it's really been a a sort of a change in style in the way the streaming companies approach their whole creative process versus the broadcast networks, which are totally driven by advertising revenue, and really they live or die. Every show lives or dies by those ratings, week to week. Act break to act break, practically. Unlike that, one of the wonderful part of the I have about the music, which I'm really proud of, is that we always felt like we had this long creative leash. And that's the Netflix, and you can even say the Amazon model at following not too far behind, has always been hiring really great people, like David Fincher and great filmmakers, and sort of letting them tell their story, turning them loose, not over directing the process. And of course, that has some risk. And Netflix has always said, we know we're going to hit a few foul balls, but we want to have real original voices telling the stories. And I felt there was a freedom I always felt in writing this score that I have. I felt it a couple times on indie movies or small movies where there wasn't a big studio involved or a big network sort of hierarchy. And so that in particular, I'm really proud of. I felt like for my own work, I felt like I was able to take more risks, do more things musically that I might not necessarily go to in a more commercial or broadcast type of traditional broadcast underscoring. It's just a different style. So that I think is really something I'm proud that we sort of broke that ground. And obviously, there's so many people now following and writing amazing. There's so much amazing work being done musically now for the small screen.
And you won two Emmys for the show, including one just 2 years ago. I believe you got four nominations overall for the series. You've gotten five Emmy wins in total. So I think I've got my numbers right. But what did that recognition mean for you?
It was incredible because I remember when we first did the first season of House of Cards. I did a for your consideration screening with David Fincher, and I think at that time nobody was even doing that kind of thing. And now you look at the landscape of the Emmy award season is probably as full and as competitive as the end of year, a cinematic season with the Golden Globes and the Oscars, which are sort of obviously very prestigious in their own right. But it's funny, like Emmys always felt like sort of, the stepchild of those. Now it feels like as much as the main event of anything, and I'm just trying to say it was a huge honor because I realized just how much work there is out there. So to be recognized by my peers, man, what a huge honor.
Yeah. So what are you working on now that the show is wrapped up?
A couple of things. I have a film out in theaters right now that's a wonderful little documentary called The Biggest Little Farm. I just opened in LA, New York. It's going to many more cities this weekend, and really beautiful film about sort of nature and the environment, but it's a very personal film too. Really, it's hard to encapsulate simply, but I just encourage people to go see it because it's really special. Also did I did a new series that's going to be on ABC this summer called Grand Hotel, which was really fun to do. It's just sort of a soapy drama. The protagonists are Latin American family, which I really love. I love that feeling of inclusion in terms of who are Americans. They're actually they are the wealthy people. There's a little bit of an upstairs downstairs thing, so it's nice because it also explores those issues of class and uh, wealth and really the wealth divide, which I think is becoming a huge story in America and in a lot of places now.
Yeah.
The other thing that's really been fun, really thrilling for me, I think we might have even talked about this last time, but yeah, I've been quite active in the concert world. I just had a song cycle which was premiered by the St. Louis Symphony with Leonard Slatkin conducting and Hila Plittman, this amazing soprano, called the Paper Line Shack. And well, hopefully we get some more. I think there's some more performances of that coming in future cities. And I have a commission for the LA Master Chorale that'll be premiering at Disney Hall in January of 2020.
I remember you mentioning that. Yeah, that's very
Yeah.
very exciting. Lastly, I wanted to ask you, I mean, this is not the first long form television show you've worked on. You've done quite a bit, things like Monk, Ugly Betty, just to name a few. What for you is the benefit of working, and you do a lot of movies as well, as you said. What is the benefit for you of working on a show for several years? What does that do for you as a composer?
Uh, a 2 hour movie is a great format. And I love film scores. And actually, I have a film that I did last year, Bigger, that's coming on to HBO in a couple weeks. But in that time span, you can only go too far. You can only go so far into character, into themes, into materials. A 6 hour series, I mean, a 6 season series or 8 seasons of Monk or any of these, it's a much more expansive canvas musically, and it's fun because once you sort of build the world and you sort of know where you're playing in, it more becomes the art of trying to find different variations and different sort of paths, but you sort of know what the house looks like, You're kind of rearranging the furniture and redesigning rooms, but it's the same house. So I think that's really fascinating. I mean, I think the writing can go into different layers of character. I remember Kevin saying several years ago at one of our premieres, it's like layers of the onion. You just sort of peel off layer by layer, both as a performer and a writer, but also as a composer. You sort of try to uncover those subterranean levels of the persona, which we all have, and that's really fascinating to me because I think people are. As a viewer too, I enjoy these things. I enjoy these sort of deep dives into a character, into a story. It's a much different format than a 2 hour movie.
Well, Jeff, I feel like this is the end of an era because I've been talking with you about House of Cards for several years now, but I'm sure that very soon you'll have something else for us to talk about as well.
I'm looking forward to that, Zach. Although it's been an incredible run, and I really appreciate your support all over the years, and it's been always been a pleasure to speak with you.
Same here. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time again.
Take care. Bye.
You too. And thanks to all of you at home for watching. Make sure you click the subscribe button below and make sure you visit us at goldderby.com for all the latest Emmy news.